Hello and welcome to It's Histocracy with me, Wafi, Daniel, and Paul, where we rate and debate your all-time favourite events in world history. Today marks our first podcast, and we are celebrating Black History Month, and therefore we will be discussing a greatly interesting topic, the transatlantic triangle slave trade.
Of course, there are many ways we can look at the slave trade, but what we can take from it is that it's influenced our modern world today a lot. Before we move on to the actual debate, let's go through our related breaking news section for this podcast. Over to Daniel.
So, recently, the Black Lives Matter movement was introduced to get rid of stereotypes about race and has touched many hearts. Many riots and protests against brutality to black people have started up, and it does seem like this will leave a mark in the pages of history. Are you involved? If you believe that we are a community, then show your support. Also, Facebook and other social media sites have announced new policies to stop discrimination, and hopefully this is another step to a better society.
Now back to the debate. Today we'll be looking at the triangle trade, which took place from the 17th to 19th century at its best times, and involved European countries taking and selling slaves from Western African areas looking to import more goods from the newly discovered Americans, which had a lot of valuable items like spices and tobaccos which could be sold in Europe for hefty sums. This is how the trade worked. Europe and North America both imported slaves and other valuables such as gold and ivory, and Africa in turn imported guns, clothes, and iron and beer back to Europe and America.
Today, this sort of trade would be completely illegal and wrong because it relied on something we cannot have today: slaves.
Yes, the trade worked by goods produced in Europe like guns, clothes, iron and beer going to Western Africa via ship, which was then traded for African enslaved people in return for these goods. These slaves would be handcuffed all over their body and would be stuffed together on ships that would take weeks to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. This led to awful conditions for the slaves, which created more disease for the slaves due to the terrible living conditions they had there. This led to 2 million dying on the ships, a tragedy in itself.
After the long trip from Western Africa, the slaves got sold off to different parts of America, like the Caribbean or the 13 colonies, for different goods like rum, iron, gunpowder, rice, and silk, etc., and then finally came back home, where they were sold off by the rich voyagers for a big profit.
Despite the grief and disappointment caused by this moral catastrophe, there are some positives like the eventual introduction of black people into our society. Due to these trade relations between Britain and the West Indies, it allowed for the monumental HMS Windrush to bring in approximately 700 West Indian people into the UK.
This would then bring in black culture in our society, with things like rap, blues, and jabs, and more importantly, the beginning of the end of racial divide and racism. HMS Windrush was just one of many ships that got many black people whose families had once been most likely part of the slave trade from Europe and particularly Britain.
From our bird's eye view, we can easily tell something is missing, and this system would never be accepted now. But why did it work in those times?
The triangle trade worked because not all countries produce all types of goods. For example, Africa and the Americas were able to produce different spices and materials like ivory, and therefore Britain and Europe were able to benefit from these by selling slaves. Britain produced a lot of manufactured goods, as they were developed in industry and were at the top of their league, and so these luxury goods could be exported. African slaves were sold to Portugal, who had very much founded the slave trade, as well as Britain and the Americas and the Spanish American colonies. Africa in return took a lot of weapons, and this was due to the wars that Africa was part of and the conflict happening there.
However, it is important to note that for some reason industrialization came before morality at this time, and therefore there was no care that slaves were humans.
One thing we must consider is that raw materials were very important at this time, because manufacturing and primary and secondary work was very common, and tertiary services weren't as common and needed.
So, how did the triangle trade help Britain? The triangle trade meant that Britain could increase the size of their royal navy and the trade of merchants. New raw materials also meant fueling for the Industrial Revolution later on, and empire. There was growth in shipping, as colonies needed to be protected and plantation crops and exports needed steady control, as without good ships, trade would not be reliable. In 1739, the Direct Export Act helped British planters to ship goods directly to Europe. The slave trade also was used as a training ground for seamen, providing experienced crews for the merchant, marine, and Royal Navy. As exports grew, the industries of manufacturing in England grew bigger, and so business owners could look for further mechanization, and this meant that supply of products got higher, and products got cheaper to improve the economy of Britain.
Furthermore, from 1750, cotton production grew more, and this was better than the wool industry before, as machinery could process cotton fibers better than wool. This was one of the foundations of the Industrial Revolution around the rest of Britain. As a result of this, cotton soon became Britain's greatest export industry. Statistics show that in 1800, workers could spin 200 times more cotton than in 1700. Yet not all created bad morals though, as we have the example of Edward Colton, who donated 100,000 to the city of Bristol, which eventually was used to found a boys' school named after him. Some good causes did not come out of the new wealth made by the merchants.
More urbanization began, and populations of small towns like Bristol and Liverpool quadrupled. New ports, such as that in Glasgow, were developed and began to be used more often, and this made more cities wealthier than in previous. This led to lower taxes being asked by the government and more infrastructure being built over time. Canals and railways were built from the investment of the profits from the slave trade, and the development of water and steam power led to the rapid spread of new factories.
However, near the end of the 18th century, the need for more income for the nation in building for the Industrial Revolution was less, so the trade overall became much less popular. Only a narrow amount of people also benefited with huge wealth from the slave trade, as many people still had to pay taxes, which were used for wars and capturing colonies, which wouldn't have helped them. Also, there was a high death rate, particularly from disease, that posed the trade as a graveyard for seamen.
So why did Portugal start the slave trade? It was one of the first European nations becoming a colonial empire. The slave owners, after Portugal colonized several Atlantic Galapagos islands, wanted the area to be called a crusade to allow the horrific control of the people. Also, black people being an inferior race led them to be more of an object than a human. Mainly from the discovery did slave owners realize how much money they could get from this trade, that they pushed for the clearance and allowance from the government. There was a Christian belief in around the time of 1441, when the African islands were discovered, that any non-Christian believers could be taken from war. However, when the first slave auction took place in Portugal, there were mixed feelings among the population, but nothing was stopping the horrific actions, because the crown and the rich and powerful slave merchants were only making more money, so why would they stop?
In ancient times, when slavery still existed, there were many rules made for slave trafficking. In 1442, we see that D. Henry, who was a rich man looking to increase his slave trade, pushed for the elevation of the raids in West Africa into a crusade to legitimize the slavery. In 1452, even the Pope said that any non-Christians are deemed slaves and enemies to God. This was pushed for and happened when the enslavement took place for the next 100 years. Also, the leaders of the areas in West Africa, like the Kingdom of Dahomey, agreed to the trade agreement set by Portugal, and this allowed its people to be taken into slavery for the next 300 years. Therefore, we can see that the overall reasons for starting the trade by Portugal was for profits for those in power, for slave merchants and the crown, and also for better control over the taken areas, so that they could use the colonially taken places' resources for money and power.
Finally, we can see how black culture is still embedded in our society. Music, with things like blues, rap, and jazz, are really, really big in our society, and they are very dear to us. Also, traditions like this one, Black History Month, are really big, and just basic diversity and the mixing of ideas are becoming more and more in our society as well. Now we will open a debate. Which parts of the slave trade influence our society today the most?
I believe that it was the railways and the infrastructure that helped Britain the most. In preparing for empire and the huge British Empire that reigned for a long time, the Royal Navy was one of the biggest helps in this. And training seamen was what would create the Royal Navy. And the slave trade was the primary source of that. Also, as you saw, Edward Colton built new schools, and these were very important in developing our society to the intellectual society it is today.
However, I believe that music was one of the biggest ways in which the slave trade influenced our society today. For example, Drake is the highest selling individual artist based on certified units, and when you look at the charts today, you can see most of the artists up the top are from a black history, and this influenced everything today. Thank you everyone for listening, and what do you think was the most influencing? Make sure to like and subscribe if you found this interesting, and we'll see you on the next one.